I am Hira Sheikh, PhD candidate at Queensland University of Technology. Today, I will be presenting my research on multi-species speculative futures of smart urban ecologies. With a series of recent and interconnected events like pandemic, climate change, wildfires, and biodiversity loss that we have been experiencing across the world, there is a renewed awareness about the damaging impact humans have had on the planet Earth. But another problem, as the philosopher Dalia Nasser points out, is that the environmental crisis is also a crisis of knowledge and imagination that is disconnected from the environmental reality. My research looks at this disconnection from environmental reality in context of cities, particularly in the context of smart urban governance. Further, I explore how smart urban governance can be geared to produce urban policies that are based on knowledge and imagination that is more in tune with the environmental reality. In my study, Smart Urban Governance describes how urban governance has been transformed by the use of digital technologies and resulting data. City governments increasingly use urban data to inform policies on sustainable growth. However, these policies are often driven by technocratic and human-centered approaches that are considered damaging to the natural world. To address this issue, my research examines smart urban governance through a more than human lens. The term more than human refers to the entirety of ecological life, including animals, plants, rivers, microbes, and even humans. The scholar David Abraham first coined the term more than human to emphasize the significance of human, non-human entanglements over the centrality of humans. As you can see in the two images, the human-centered city on the left does not account for the messy embodiment, which nurtures the interdependent and interconnected human-non-human ecologies in more than human city on the right. In other words, my research probes the disconnection between human-centered smart urban governance and its often advanced environmental objectives. Further, the research suggests ways of bridging this gap through a holistic understanding of smart urban governance by understanding social and environmental justice in cities through the lens of multiple species. As highlighted earlier, city governments increasingly use data to inform urban policies. And this can equally be applied to biodiversity conservation approaches. The recognition of the planetary crisis has been facilitated by the environmental sensing technologies. Therefore, the environmental sensing technologies are now considered instrumental in gathering accurate and detailed data on the environment. This also includes urban biodiversity. However, scholars across discipline have criticized these technologies for being limited to human perception, exercising spatial control on non-human species, and reducing non-human species into never-ending charts, graphs that inform policies. While we have more data available on urban biodiversity because of these technological advances, the question is, if the data gathered is meant to influence biodiversity conservation in a meaningful way, then how might we make room for understanding multi-species complexities that are not accounted for, no matter how many more data points we add? The disregard towards more than human life in how biodiversity data is collected and used to inform policies is not a result of less or inaccurate data, but of the positivist paradigm which promotes technocratic and human-centered approaches. To address the environmental crisis, we need to reconsider the broader human-centered methodologies like positivism, capitalism, and colonialism that increase the disconnection between the knowledge we produce from the environmental reality. For this, we can turn to more than human thinking. In my study, I take the more than human approach as attuning to the wisdom of multiple species through different languages of the natural world that can emerge as sounds, odors, bodily movements, and rhythms of the season. I explore how different non-human life forms speak. How do they inhabit time and physical space in our cities? How do they form symbiotic relations with other species and their environment? For instance, one example of multi-species wisdom is underground tree fungal networks that help the trees communicate, share nutrients, and send warning signals to each other. As Richard Powers, author of the book Overstory, expresses, link enough trees together and a forest grows aware. Whereas the tree fungal networks are strong in a forest, in cities, the urban development has disrupted communication between trees, which leads to weakened tree communities in our cities. But if we start listening to the tree fungal networks, we can find ways to collaborate with them to strengthen their communities in our cities. Here, digital technologies can be used to listen to such non-human communication, and then later this communication can be applied to inform policies that can help us realize multi-species cities. The question now is, how do we translate more than human perspectives on the use of environmental sensing technologies to policy environments that can enable multi-species urban futures? The approach I suggest to translate more than human perspectives on environmental sensing technologies to urban policies is transition design. Transition design is a process where different urban stakeholders collectively envision alternate futures to inform practical yet radical interventions in the present regarding the long-term social and environmental issues. Therefore, transition design calls for a cyclical process of forecasting and backcasting. Forecasting is a process of extrapolating present trends into the future. Backcasting, on the other hand, outlines alternate futures and analyzes their consequences to inform decisions on either how to materialize certain futures or how to avoid certain futures in the present. The primary function of transition design is not to predict futures, but rather to design interventions that can guide a pathway to attain desirable futures. Transition design rests on the premise that the present can be informed by future-oriented visions. Therefore, speculative scenario building is integral to transition design. Speculation is a tool for creative vision which helps to mold feasible future situations outside the constraints of existing neoliberal governance structures. Using dynamics of the present time as a starting point, building a speculative scenario is like constructing a plot that embodies knowledge of nature, people, and situations. Transition design includes the creation of speculative scenarios, and this is usually a teamwork carried out for creating policy interventions that can guide pathways to attain desirable futures. Transition design in my research will follow the four-step process of forecasting, future scoping, story making, and backcasting to envision more than human futures of smart urban governance. To speculate multi-species urban policies, the more than human futures under smart urban governance will be investigated through the lens of three governance frameworks: natural capital, earth jurisprudence, and urban common. The three governance frameworks function to preserve the biodiversity with different ideologies and emerge from different fields. Natural capital framework emerges from the field of economics, but jurisprudence emerges from the field of environmental law, and the urban commons framework emerges from the field of critical urban studies. Next, I will explain how the three governance models differ in their approach to conserve biodiversity. The natural capital framework regards the natural ecosystem as capital assets that generate income. Consequently, any depletion of the natural resources or urban biodiversity is considered a loss of capital value. Earth jurisprudence is a philosophy of law and governance that is based on the fact that humans are only one part of a wider community of beings, and that the welfare of each member of that community is dependent on the welfare of Earth as a whole. The philosophy is further rooted in values of interdependence, interconnectedness, and living within ecological limits. It acknowledges all living beings, landforms, and rivers have rights to thrive on Earth. The concept of commons has come to prominence in critical urban studies as an effort to deconstruct the neoliberal city and governmentality. The framework of urban commons is grounded on principles of decentralization, inclusion, circular economies, place-based knowledge, co-created urban data, and co-governance. The process of commoning has largely been limited to humans. However, recently scholars have positioned the concept of commoning as a more than human process which mediates the interests of both human and non-human communities. Under each speculative governance framework, diverse urban stakeholders will be invited to imagine more than human future scenarios, exploring either koalas in urban bushlands, soil ecologies on urban farms, Australian white ibis in urban centers. They will build speculative futures, taking these scenarios in the present as their starting point. Koalas are an endangered species. Given the deforestation, bushfires, and rapid urban expansion, the future of the dwindling koala communities is at stake. It is no longer feasible to regard koalas as fungible commodities in land use conflicts arising from urban development proposals on the bushlands. Spatial planning technologies mapping koalas instead of protecting the koala habitats are often used to further strengthen policies favoring humans, for example, environmental offsets. Therefore, the scenario koalas in urban bushlands will be mobilized to envision a future where humans give koalas equal habitat rights by rethinking smart urban governance through a more than human lens. More than half of all terrestrial biodiversity is in soil. Fungus, especially mycelium, along with earthworms and bacteria make the soil fertile. Soil biodiversity informs, suggests, guides, and warns, and lends to food production with its wisdom. However, the disregarding soil and its biodiverse wisdom, agriculture has turned to technologically manipulating soil ecosystems to produce food. Therefore, the scenario soil ecologies on urban farms will be mobilized to envision a future where humans give soil biodiversity, including crops, pests, and other fertile critters, equal stakeholder rights, and not treat them just as an extractive resource by rethinking smart urban governance through a more than human lens. Since the migration of white ibis into Australian cities, there are two dominant narratives around ibis in urban spaces, namely ibis as pest and ibis as victim. The ibis as pest narrative positions the ibis as unworthy of cohabiting urban space as it disrupts human control in the city. On the other hand, the ibis as the victim narrative emphasizes how ibis migrated to urban locations because of human-inflicted damage to their original habitats. With emergence of digital technologies in urban governance space, such binary narratives are reinforced when ibis is confined to numbers. For example, occurrence records indicating an unwanted increase in their population. Therefore, the scenario Australian white ibis in urban centers will be mobilized to envision a future where humans give ibises an equal right to the city by rethinking smart urban governance through a more than human lens. Through these three scenarios, the research will discuss the potential of transition design to address the limitations of human-centered smart urban governance to attain more sustainable, multi-species urban futures.